Part 1. The story no one told. People have written countless words about Audrey Hepburn. Documentaries, books, interviews. Her life has been examined from every possible angle. Her elegance, her career, her humanitarian work. She is remembered as a symbol of grace in a world that often lacked it. But there is a part of her story that almost never gets told. Not because it wasn't important, but because it didn't belong to her alone. It belonged to two boys, two brothers, who lived through the same childhood, the same war, the same broken family, and yet, somehow, disappeared from history. Their names were Alex and Ian, and most people have never heard of them. To understand who they were, you have to step away from the image the world knows. You have to leave behind the polished photographs, the Hollywood lights, the carefully preserved legacy, and go back to something much quieter, something far less certain. It begins with a family that was never quite whole. Long before Audrey Hepburn became a global icon, before the world knew her face, there was a household shaped by movement, distance, and decisions that could not be undone. At the center of it was their mother, Ella, a woman born into Dutch aristocracy, a woman who came from privilege, from history, from a name that carried weight long before she ever had children. But privilege does not guarantee stability, and history does not protect a family from breaking apart. In the early years, life looked almost ideal from the outside. Travel, opportunity, a future that seemed wide open. But inside the family, something was already shifting. Marriages strained, absences grew longer, and slowly, quietly, the idea of home began to lose its meaning. Alex, the eldest, arrived first. Then Ian. Two brothers, close enough in age to share a childhood, but not close enough to escape what was coming. Their early years were marked not by roots, but by movement, between countries, between cultures, between versions of a life that never quite settled. And then, everything changed. Their mother made a decision that would reshape all of their lives. She left, not just a marriage, but a world, and for a time, even her own children. It is easy to look back and judge moments like that, to ask how or why. But families are rarely that simple. What matters is what came after. Because one day, without warning, she came back. And just as suddenly as she had left, she took them with her. A new home, a new man, a new version of a family, and soon after, a new child. A little girl who would grow up to become one of the most recognizable faces in the world. But at that moment, she was just their sister, younger, bright, watching everything. Growing up in a household that was already carrying more tension than it could hold. For a brief time, there was something that almost felt normal. Photographs from those years show something rare. 3 children together, smiling, playing, climbing trees, sharing moments that, for a while, felt untouched by everything around them. But it didn't last. It never did. Because this was not a story about stability. It was a story about interruption, about lives constantly being reshaped by forces outside their control. Soon, the brothers were sent away. Boarding schools, separate paths, a childhood divided into pieces. And just like that, the small window of togetherness began to close. For Audrey, it meant growing closer to her mother. For Alex and Ian, it meant something else entirely. Another kind of distance, another kind of silence. And then, just as the family was trying to find its footing again, the world itself began to shift. Because in 1939, something was coming. Something that would not just break families, but reshape entire lives. And for Alex and Ian, it would force them into choices that would define who they became. choices that almost no one would ever hear about. Part 2. A childhood divided. The years that followed did not unfold in a straight line. They broke apart quietly, not with one dramatic moment, but through a series of decisions that pulled the family in different directions until what remained no longer felt like a single home. At first, there were still glimpses of something whole. Afternoons spent outdoors, small moments of laughter, the kind of memories that only exist because, for a brief time, no one is thinking about how fragile everything is. Alex and Ian were older now, old enough to notice change, but still young enough to feel it without fully understanding it. Their younger sister, Audrey, watched them both closely. To her, they were not distant figures in a complicated family. They were simply her brothers. But childhood does not last equally for everyone. And for Alex and Ian, it ended early. Their father's work, and later the instability within the household, meant the family never stayed in one place for long. Belgium, England, the Netherlands. Each move felt like a temporary solution. Each new house, a place they were expected to adjust to without question. Eventually, the decision was made. The boys would be sent away. Boarding school. At the time, it was considered proper, expected even. For families of their background, this was not unusual. Education was not just about learning, it was about shaping discipline, character, independence. But what it often meant, in reality, was distance. For Alex and Ian, it meant growing up away from the people who were supposed to be their constant. It meant learning to navigate life in institutions rather than in a home. And perhaps most importantly, it meant that whatever fragile connection existed between them and their sister began to fade into something occasional, something partial. They saw each other during holidays, short visits, fragments of time that never quite lasted long enough to rebuild what had been lost. For Audrey, the absence was felt differently. She had always been quieter, more inward. Without her brothers around, her world became smaller, more centered on her mother. That closeness would shape her in ways that would follow her into adulthood. But for Alex and Ian, something else was forming. A kind of independence that was not chosen, but imposed. They had already experienced separation once before, from their father, from the life they had known in earlier years. Now they were being separated again. Piece by piece, the idea of family was becoming something abstract, not a place, not a daily reality, but something they returned to briefly before leaving again. And then, just as they were adjusting to this new rhythm, it broke again. In 1935, their stepfather left, not gradually, not with warning, but completely. For Audrey, it would remain the most painful memory of her childhood. Years later, she would describe it in simple terms. She felt abandoned. But for Alex and Ian, the impact was quieter, less visible, perhaps, but no less significant. Because this was not the first time a father figure had disappeared from their lives. And by now, they understood something that children are never meant to understand so early. That people could leave and not come back. After that, the family scattered once more. Audrey moved with her mother to the family estate in the Netherlands. Alex and Ian spent more time connected to their father's side of the family. Once again, separate paths, separate lives. There was no single moment when the family officially became divided. No clear line you could point to and say, this is where it happened. It happened slowly, through absence, through distance, through the quiet acceptance that this was simply how things were now. And yet, despite everything, they were still connected by memory, by childhood, by something that had not completely disappeared. But the world outside their personal lives was changing too. And this time, It would not be something they could adjust to quietly. Because in 1939, Europe stood on the edge of something far larger than any one family, something that would not just separate them, but test them in ways none of them could have imagined. Part 3. When war reached their doorstep. In September 1939, the world shifted. War had been building for years, spoken about in headlines, debated in political circles. But for many families, it still felt distant, something that happened elsewhere, something that might never truly arrive. Like many in the Netherlands, their mother believed in neutrality. The country had remained untouched during the First World War. There was a quiet confidence that it might happen again. So she made a decision. Audrey was brought back from England. For the first time in years, the family found themselves under the same roof again. Alex was 19, Ian 15, Audrey 10. It was not a perfect reunion. Too much time had passed. Too many separate lives had been lived. But there was something familiar in it. Shared meals, evenings spent together. A sense, however brief, that the distance of the past could be set aside. For a moment, it almost felt like a family again. Then, in May 1940, everything changed. Germany invaded the Netherlands. The illusion of safety collapsed almost instantly. Within days, the Dutch forces surrendered. Occupation began. What followed was not immediate chaos. It was something slower, more controlled, and in many ways, more suffocating. Rules appeared first. Curfews, restrictions, registrations. Then came the changes to daily life. Shops altered what they displayed. Public spaces began to feel watched. The language of authority shifted into something colder, more rigid. And beneath it all, a quiet pressure began to build. Young men were being monitored, expected to cooperate, expected to participate. Programs were introduced, subtle at first, designed to pull them into alignment with the occupying power. For Alex and Ian, this was not theoretical. It was personal. They were exactly the age the system was designed to reach, old enough to be useful, young enough to be shaped. The expectation was simple: comply, register, participate. But not everyone did. Both brothers refused. It may not sound dramatic in words, but in an occupied country, refusal was not a small act. It marked you. It placed you outside the system. And once you stepped outside, there was no easy way back. At first, the consequences were not immediate. Life continued, on the surface. But the pressure increased. Every decision became heavier. Every action carried risk. For Alex, that pressure led to a choice, a quiet one, but irreversible. In 1941, he disappeared. There was no message, no explanation, no trace. For the family, silence meant only one thing. They believed he was gone, not lost, not missing, gone. For months, then years, there was nothing to replace that absence, no confirmation, no closure, just the steady weight of not knowing. But Alex had not vanished without reason. He had stepped into something far more dangerous than simply staying. And while his path would take him into the shadows, Ian's would move in a different direction, more visible, more direct, and in some ways, even more dangerous. Because as the occupation tightened its grip on daily life, resistance began to grow, quietly at first, then with increasing urgency, and Ian was already moving toward it. Part 4. 2 brothers, 2 wars. By the time the occupation settled into daily life, both brothers had already made their choices, not loudly, not publicly, but in ways that would shape everything that followed. Alex had stepped away first, without explanation, without a trace. For those at home, it felt like disappearance. But in reality, it was a movement toward resistance. He joined Dutch forces that were still attempting, in scattered and uncertain ways, to oppose the occupation. It was not the kind of organized military effort people imagine when they think of war. There were no guarantees, no clear lines, just fragments of resistance trying to hold together against something far larger. Eventually, those efforts collapsed. The forces were overwhelmed, and Alex was captured. For many, that would have been the end of the story. A prison camp, a name on a list, another life swallowed by the war. But Alex did something few managed to do. He escaped. What followed was not freedom. It was something more uncertain. He went underground, living without identity, moving between safe locations, relying on people whose names history rarely records. Every day became a calculation: where to go, who to trust, how long to stay. There was no contact with his family, no way to send word, no reassurance that he was still alive. And for those at home, that silence deepened, year after year, with nothing to replace it. But while Alex disappeared into hiding, Ian moved in the opposite direction. He stayed, visible, active, and as he grew older, he stepped directly into resistance. At first, it was small, tasks that seemed simple on the surface, distributing underground leaflets, passing along messages, encouraging others to question what was happening around them. But in an occupied country, nothing was small. Every action carried risk. Every message could be traced. Every connection could be broken under pressure. Ian understood that, and continued anyway. He became involved in efforts that went beyond quiet resistance. He helped support communication networks that kept people informed, links to the outside world, to voices that had not been silenced. He encouraged disruption, strikes, particularly within the railway system. That choice mattered, because the railways were not just transportation. They were part of the machinery of occupation, moving soldiers, moving supplies, and, most tragically, moving people toward destinations they would never return from. To interfere with that system was not symbolic. It had real consequences. Eventually, those actions caught up with him. Ian was arrested. There was no long warning, no gradual escalation, just the sudden shift from resistance to captivity. He was taken away from the Netherlands, transported to Berlin, and placed into forced labor, a factory, long hours, minimal food, constant exhaustion. He was still a teenager, surrounded by people in similar conditions, each carrying their own story, their own losses, their own silence. There was no way to contact home, no way to explain what had happened. And once again, the family was left with absence. 2 sons, both gone, both alive somewhere, but unreachable. For their mother, for Audrey, the war became something deeply personal, not just something happening outside, but something that had taken the people closest to them and scattered them into unknown places. And yet, even in that uncertainty, life continued. Days passed, seasons changed, the occupation tightened. And back at home, another story was unfolding, one that would shape Audrey in ways the world would later see, but never fully understand. Part 5. The War at Home. While Alex remained hidden and Ian endured captivity, the war continued to reshape everything at home, not through sudden events alone, but through a steady, tightening pressure that reached into every part of daily life. By 1942, the occupation had become harsher, less controlled, more unpredictable. Punishments were no longer limited to those directly involved in resistance. They extended outward, to families, to communities, to anyone who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. That year, an act of resistance led to retaliation. 5 Dutch civilians were executed, not because they were responsible, but because they were available. Among them was a member of the extended family, a man connected not by blood, but by closeness. His death was not just a loss, it was a message. For their mother, whatever uncertainty remained about the occupation disappeared in that moment. What had once been distant, even misunderstood, was now undeniable. After that, the household changed. They left their previous home, moved to a smaller town, lived under the protection of an older generation. But protection, during those years, was a fragile idea. Because the war did not stay outside, it entered slowly, through shortages, through restrictions, through fear. Food became scarce. Simple things, bread, milk, basic supplies, were no longer guaranteed. Meals grew smaller, then irregular, then uncertain. By the winter of 1944, the situation collapsed entirely. It became known as the Hunger Winter. Temperatures dropped, supplies stopped. Entire regions were cut off. People began to survive on whatever they could find. For many, that meant eating things never meant to be food: roots, substitutes, even tulip bulbs. The body does not adapt easily to starvation. It weakens, slows, breaks down in ways that are difficult to reverse. Audrey was still a teenager, and like millions of others, she endured it. Malnutrition left its mark. Fatigue, illness. A body forced to survive on far less than it needed. But the physical effects were only part of it. There were things she saw, things that stayed. Trains passing through stations, families being transported, people leaving without knowing where they were going. Moments that, at the time, could not fully be understood, but would never be forgotten. Despite everything, there were small acts of resistance. Quiet ones, the kind that rarely appear in official records, messages carried, movements observed. Information passed carefully from one place to another. Children were often overlooked, and because of that, they became part of something larger, not as soldiers, but as participants. Every action, no matter how small, existed under risk. And yet, it continued. At home, there was no certainty about the future, no clear sense of when or if things would change, only endurance, day by day. And always, the same questions remained. Where was Alex? Was he alive? Where was Ian? Would he come back? There were no answers, only time. But as the winter deepened, something else was approaching. Not slowly, not quietly, but with force. Because after years of occupation, of loss, of survival, the war was finally beginning to end. Part 6. The End of the War. By early 1945, the war had already taken almost everything it could. What remained was exhaustion, cities damaged, families scattered, lives reduced to survival. But something was shifting. The Allied forces were advancing. Slowly, at first, then with increasing certainty. In April 1945, liberation reached their part of the Netherlands. For those who had lived under occupation for years, it did not feel like a sudden victory. It felt unfamiliar. Soldiers arrived, uniforms changed, voices sounded different. And for the first time in years, the pressure lifted. But relief did not come all at once. Bodies weakened by hunger could not recover instantly. People who had lived in fear did not immediately feel safe. Even something as simple as food had to be approached carefully. After years of scarcity, abundance could overwhelm the body. For Audrey, the memory remained vivid. Chocolate, something that once represented comfort, became too much, too quickly. It was a small moment, but it captured something larger. The war had ended, but its effects had not. In the weeks that followed, aid began to arrive: supplies, clothing, basic necessities that had been missing for years. Communities began to rebuild, slowly, cautiously. And then, something even more important happened. Alex came home. There had been no word from him for years, no confirmation, no certainty. And then, suddenly, he was there, alive. He had survived everything that had kept him hidden: the capture, the escape, the years spent moving between places, avoiding detection. He did not return alone. He came back with a wife, and soon after, a child. Life had continued, even in silence. For the family, it was more than a reunion. It was the closing of a wound that had been left open for too long. But there was still one question left unanswered. Ian. Where was he? The war in Europe was ending. Berlin had fallen. The system that had held him was collapsing. But there was still no sign of him. Then one day, he returned. Not by transport, not through official channels, but on foot. From Berlin to the Netherlands. Hundreds of miles. Through a landscape that had been damaged by war. Roads broken. Cities reduced to fragments. People moving in every direction, trying to find their way back to something familiar. And among them, Ian. There was no certainty waiting for him at the end of that journey. No guarantee that his family was still there. Only a direction. And the decision to follow it. When he reached home, the moment was quiet. No ceremony, no announcement. Just a house, a window, and something small that told him everything he needed to know. A familiar object, still in place, unchanged. It meant one thing. They were alive, after everything. The separation, the silence, the years of uncertainty. The family was together again, not unchanged, not untouched, but alive, and in that moment, that was enough. Part 7. Life after survival. When the war ended, it did not restore what had been lost. It simply allowed life to begin again. The family was together once more, but not in the way it had once been. Too much had happened. Too much had changed. Years of separation cannot be undone in a single moment. And survival, as it turns out, is only the beginning of something else. Each of them carried the war differently. For Alex, it remained largely unspoken. He had lived in hiding, moved through uncertainty, relied on silence as protection. And after the war, that silence stayed. He built a life, a family, a future that, from the outside, looked steady. But the years he had lived underground, the decisions he had made, the risks he had taken, they remained his. Not something he explained, not something he shared. Ian's path was similar in its quietness, but shaped by a different experience. He had seen the war from inside captivity, inside forced labor, inside a system that reduced people to function rather than identity. He survived it, returned home, rebuilt his life. And like his brother, he spoke very little about what he had endured. There are some experiences that do not translate into words easily, not because they are forgotten, but because they are too complete, too heavy to reduce into explanation. So instead, they become something else, something internal. For both brothers, the war became part of who they were, but not something they offered to the world. And while they moved quietly forward, their younger sister's life took a different direction. Audrey Hepburn left the Netherlands in the years after the war. She pursued ballet first, driven, focused. But the effects of the war had already shaped her body in ways she could not fully overcome. Malnutrition, weakness, limitations that made a full career in dance difficult. So she changed direction, from dance to acting. and what followed was rapid, almost disorienting in its speed. Within a few years, she moved from uncertainty to recognition, from recognition to success, from success to global fame. By the early 1950s, she was no longer just a young woman rebuilding her life. She had become something else entirely: a public figure, a symbol, a presence recognized across the world. The contrast was striking. Less than a decade earlier, she had been a teenager surviving hunger and occupation. Now she stood in front of cameras, in a completely different world. But despite the distance between those two realities, the connection remained. The war had not left her. It shaped the way she saw the world, the way she responded to suffering, the way she understood what it meant to have nothing and then to have everything. And while her life moved into the public eye, her brothers remained where they had always been, in the background, not by choice, not by exclusion, but because their lives had taken a different path. They had survived, they had rebuilt, they had continued, without seeking recognition, without needing to explain themselves. They appeared occasionally, in photographs, in brief mentions, in the edges of a story that was no longer centered on them. And over time, something else happened. Their experiences began to fade from public memory, not completely, but enough that they became secondary, context, supporting detail. The brothers, the ones who were there, the ones who lived through it, but rarely the ones the story focused on. And yet, without them, the story itself would not be complete. Part 8. What history forgot. There is a certain way history remembers people. It focuses on the visible, the ones who stand at the center of the frame, the ones whose lives are documented, celebrated, retold. And then there are others, people who were there, who lived through the same events, made decisions just as difficult, endured circumstances just as severe, but were never meant to be the focus. Alex and Ian belonged to that second group. Their lives were not incomplete. They were not defined only by their connection to Audrey Hepburn. They were full lives, separate, complex. Alex was not just a name in the background of a famous biography. He was a young man who refused to comply when it mattered, who was captured, who escaped, who lived for years without certainty, without safety, and still found his way back. Ian was not just a supporting detail in someone else's story. He was a teenager who chose resistance, who was arrested, who endured forced labor, who survived a collapsing city, and then walked across a broken landscape to return home. These are not small things. They are entire stories. But stories like theirs often remain quiet, not because they lack meaning, but because they were never told loudly. After the war, both brothers did something that many survivors chose to do. They continued. They built lives, families, careers, and they carried what they had experienced without placing it at the center of their identity. Not out of denial, not out of forgetting, but out of a kind of understanding that some things cannot be fully explained without losing something essential in the process. So they remained, largely, in silence. And over time, that silence was mistaken for absence. But it wasn't absence. It was weight. The kind of weight that does not disappear, only settles. As the years passed, the world came to know Audrey Hepburn as more than an actress. She became a symbol of compassion, of grace, of quiet strength. Her humanitarian work took her to places most people would never see. She sat with children who had nothing, spoke about hunger, about suffering, about the responsibility to respond. And in many ways, that part of her life cannot be separated from what she had lived through. From the years of war, from the hunger, from the uncertainty, from the family that endured it together, even when they were apart. Because survival does not end when the danger is gone. It continues. In the choices people make afterward, in the lives they build, in the way they carry what they have seen. Alex and Ian did not become public figures. They did not tell their stories widely. They did not step into the light. But they were there. They lived through one of the most difficult periods in modern history. They made decisions that required courage. They endured what many did not survive. And they came back, not to recognition, not to attention, but to life. There is something important in that, because history is not only made by the people we remember, it is also shaped by those we overlook, the ones who do not speak, the ones who do not explain, the ones who simply continue. Alex lived his life, and it ended in 1979. Ian lived longer, carrying his memories quietly, until 2010. Between them, they held experiences that were never fully told, moments that were never recorded, details that existed only in memory. And then, eventually, nowhere at all. But that does not make them less real. It simply means that their story has to be understood differently, not through headlines, not through fame, but through the recognition that behind every well-known life, there are others, standing just outside the frame. And sometimes, those are the stories that matter just as much.